distinguished leaders of nations, esteemed representatives of the peoples of the world, brothers and sisters of Africa, and to all who still believe that dignity is not a privilege granted by power, but the birthright of every people on this earth, I greet you in the spirit of truth, justice, and liberation. Today, I do not come to the United Nations merely to speak. I come to testify. I come to place before this assembly not only the grievances of my continent, but the irrefutable evidence of a crime that has persisted for decades, the systematic enslavement of African economies through the invisible chains of financial control. For too long, the people of Africa have been told that independence was achieved when our flags were raised and our anthems first sung. But true independence was never given. It was leased, on terms written not by free nations, but by creditors who replaced the colonial governor with the loan agreement and the whip with interest rates. The International Monetary Fund, that grand institution presented to the world as a partner of progress, has become in practice an instrument of coercion, a tool of modern imperialism that dictates policies, punishes sovereignty, and rewards submission. And so today, before this assembly of nations, I will expose 7 crimes, 7 acts of economic aggression committed by the IMF against the dignity, development, and destiny of Africa. These are not accusations of emotion. They are indictments of evidence, spoken in the name of generations who have endured debt without deliverance. The first crime is debt entrapment through perpetual borrowing. When the IMF first came to Africa, it was under the pretense of partnership, loans to rebuild, to stabilize, to support development. Yet every loan carried a poison hidden in its clauses. We were told the interest was manageable, that repayment would be simple once our economies grew. But how can a nation grow when half its budget is paid back to those who claim to help it? In reality, the debt was never meant to be repaid. It was meant to be renewed eternally. Nations like Zambia, Ghana, and Mozambique found themselves paying more in interest than they ever received in aid. The trap was perfect. The more we borrowed to survive, the more our survival depended on borrowing. And thus, Africa was bound not by chains of iron, but by contracts of debt that guaranteed poverty and dependence. The second crime of the IMF is the destruction of national sovereignty through policy imposition. What is a government that cannot decide its own budget? What is independence if your schools, hospitals, and wages must first be approved in Washington before they are approved at home? Through its structural adjustment programs, the IMF forced African states to privatize their resources, devalue their currencies, and cut social spending, all in the name of efficiency. But efficiency for whom? For the foreign investor who could now buy our land at half its value. For the multinational that could now extract our minerals without state interference. These programs dismantled the very foundations of governance. Ministers of finance became messengers to the IMF board, and parliaments were reduced to ceremonial councils whose budgets were pre-written elsewhere. The sovereignty that men and women died to defend was sold for a loan that never reached the people. The third crime is the enforced dependency on foreign currencies and markets. Africa, rich in every resource the world desires, gold, oil, diamonds, uranium, cobalt, and fertile soil, was told it could not sustain itself without foreign exchange. Our currencies were pegged, manipulated, and rendered powerless. We were made to believe that stability required surrender. Today, many African nations use currencies whose value is controlled not in Bamako, Ouagadougou, or Niamey, but in Paris and Washington. How can a nation be free when its money is the property of another? When inflation or deflation is decided not by the people's productivity, but by the interest rate of a distant Federal Reserve? This dependency was not an accident. It was engineered. The IMF ensured that Africa's prosperity remained tethered to Western markets, so that every fluctuation in their economy ripples through ours like an earthquake. And now, we come to the fourth crime, the deliberate sabotage of public infrastructure and services. Under the IMF's reform programs, governments were told to cut spending, to privatize education, to reduce healthcare budgets, to sell state utilities to private companies. Hospitals were left without medicine, schools without teachers, and power grids sold to those who valued profit over people. The argument was always the same. The private sector is more efficient. Yet what efficiency is there in a child who cannot afford school, or a mother who dies because a hospital has no doctor? This was not efficiency. This was economic euthanasia. The IMF's prescriptions turned development into dependency. Nations that once had ambitious public works projects were reduced to waiting for foreign investors to build what their own states were forbidden to fund. The fifth crime of the IMF is the erosion of agricultural self-sufficiency through market liberalization. Africa, once the cradle of sustainable farming and local production, was told to abandon its small farmers, remove subsidies, and open its markets to foreign goods. Western nations subsidized their own agriculture, while telling ours to compete without protection. The result was predictable. Our farmers went bankrupt, our lands went fallow, and our markets were flooded with cheap imports that destroyed local industries. The IMF called it integration into the global market. We call it economic invasion. The African farmer became a consumer of imported food rather than a producer of his own. Our people, who once fed themselves from the land, were made hungry in order to feed the profits of others. And yet, despite the suffering caused by these crimes, the IMF insists that its role is humanitarian, that it brings reform, discipline, and prosperity. But let us be clear, discipline without justice is oppression, and reform without sovereignty is servitude. The sixth crime is the manipulation of leadership through financial blackmail. When an African leader dares to resist IMF dictates, when he refuses to privatize the nation's water or demands fair trade for his people, the loans are frozen, the ratings downgraded, the media narratives unleashed. Suddenly, he becomes a dictator, an authoritarian, or a populist. But when a leader obeys, when he sells the state's assets and keeps the IMF's line, he is praised as reform-minded and progressive. This system of punishment and reward is not governance. It is coercion. It replaces democracy with economic extortion. I say to the world, if the cost of independence is the threat of sanctions, then we have not left colonialism. We have merely changed its vocabulary. Finally, the seventh crime, the most insidious of all, is the psychological colonization of an entire continent. For decades, our economists, our students, our policymakers have been trained to believe that progress comes from imitation, not innovation, that Africa must follow models made elsewhere. The IMF has not only shaped our economies, but our minds. It has convinced generations that we are incapable of self-management, that without its guidance, we will fall into chaos. But I ask this assembly, who created the chaos of debt? Who engineered the dependence that now strangles our budgets? Who told the richest continent in natural wealth that it was poor? It is not the African mind that is incapable. It is the global system that is unjust. The true mission of the IMF was never to stabilize, but to standardize, to ensure that every African economy remains predictable, controllable, and profitable to external powers. Brothers and sisters, these seven crimes are not abstract theories. They're lived realities. Every African child out of school, every farmer dispossessed of land, every worker unpaid for months, they are the human evidence of policies written in offices thousands of miles away. The IMF's crime is not just economic, it is moral. It claims to fight poverty, yet profits from it. It claims to promote development, yet it sabotages sovereignty. It claims neutrality, yet it enforces hierarchy, a hierarchy in which Africa is always at the bottom, paying interest on its own exploitation. And yet, in this new century, the tides are turning. The young men and women of Africa no longer accept poverty as destiny. We have learned that dignity cannot be loaned, and freedom cannot be financed. Across the Sahel, across the continent, the spirit of sovereignty is awakening again. When Burkina Faso said no to the dictates of neocolonialism, when Mali stood up to foreign interference, when Niger refused to surrender its resources, it was not rebellion. It was restoration. It was the restoration of a truth buried under decades of deception, that Africa owes nothing to those who built their empires upon our backs. Let this be understood clearly. The rejection of IMF control is not a rejection of cooperation. Africa does not oppose partnership. We oppose domination. We welcome investment, but not exploitation. We believe in trade, but not in the trading of our sovereignty. If the IMF and its sister institutions truly wish to see a prosperous Africa, then they must first acknowledge their own role in our impoverishment. For there can be no justice without accountability. And so, as I stand before this United Nations, I do not ask for pity or permission. I call for justice. I call for the end of a system that measures our worth in interest rates instead of innovation. I call for a new global order in which Africa is not the laboratory of failed experiments, but the architect of its own future. Brothers and sisters of humanity, I stand before this grand assembly not as an accuser, but as a witness to history, and as a believer in our collective power to correct it. We cannot undo the wounds of the past, but we can refuse to repeat them. The age of silent suffering has ended. A new chapter of dignity and self-determination must begin. Africa has been spoken for long enough. Today we speak for ourselves, not in anger, but in clarity. We do not come to beg for sympathy, nor to seek favor. We come to declare that the time of dependence has expired, and the age of equal partnership has dawned. The world has been built upon systems that favored the few and burdened the many, but now, those who were once the spectators of history have become its authors. What we demand is not charity, but fairness, not pity, but respect. The structure of global finance must reflect the equality of nations, not the hierarchy of empires. For decades, policies born in distant halls determined the fate of villages thousands of miles away. We were told to open our markets while others fortified theirs. We were told to cut our budgets while others subsidized their industries. We were told to trust in the invisible hand, while that very hand was busy tightening our chains. But today, the world must hear a new truth. We will no longer accept rules that make us poor in the name of discipline or powerless in the name of order. We will build a financial system rooted in cooperation, not coercion, a system that measures prosperity not by the height of towers, but by the well-being of people. The young leaders of Africa are not inheriting the broken promises of the 20th century. They're building the foundation of the 21st. Across the continent, new institutions are being born, banks of the South that lend without domination, alliances that trade without humiliation, and currencies that reflect our own productivity, not the approval of others. The change we speak of is not merely political, it is psychological, cultural, spiritual. For too long, the African mind has been told to think within limits drawn by others. We were made to believe that development was imitation. But true development begins when a people rediscover the value of their own hands, their own soil, their own genius. Let me tell you what I see when I look upon Africa today. I see nations once divided by borders, now linked by purpose. I see young engineers designing satellites over the same lands once mapped for extraction. I see farmers turning deserts green with indigenous innovation. I see women leading cooperatives that sustain entire communities. I see youth coding in cities where power once flickered. I see the birth of a continent that refuses to crawl when it can fly. The time has come for the world to stop underestimating Africa. The continent of tomorrow is not waiting for permission. It is already building its future. But to sustain that future, we must confront the architecture of inequality that still defines global economics. We must ask, who decides the value of our currencies? Who determines the risk of our credit? Who defines the worth of our resources? If the answer is always someone else, then independence remains incomplete. True independence requires economic autonomy, the ability to stand tall even when the world turns its back. In this new vision, the old order has no place. We do not seek confrontation with any nation or institution. We seek transformation. We call upon the international community to embrace a fairer compact, one that recognizes Africa not as a charity case, but as a cornerstone of global stability and innovation. Africa's natural wealth, from minerals to energy to fertile soil, is not a curse. It is a sacred trust, but it must serve its own people first. No continent can be free while its riches flow outward and its children go hungry. Therefore, we call for transparent contracts, just trade terms, and the end of the extractive mentality that has impoverished us for centuries. We also call for debt reform, for the recognition that no nation should be eternally punished for seeking to develop. Debt should not be a prison. It should be a bridge. When a nation invests in the education of its children, it invests in humanity's collective future. Let the world finance hope, not despair. And to those who say that Africa is not ready, I say, look closer. The statistics may be slow to change, but the spirit of our people has already transformed. The youth who were once called the lost generation are now the generation of creation. They are rewriting the narrative of the continent with code, art, and courage. The African city is rising, not just in height but in thought. We extend our hand to all nations who believe in fairness. Let Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean stand with us. Let Europe and North America stand as equals, not as masters. Let the world remember that the fate of humanity is intertwined. The suffering of one continent diminishes the conscience of all. Some may ask, what does Africa truly want? The answer is simple. We want what you want. We want schools that teach, hospitals that heal, fields that feed, and industries that employ. We want our mothers to live without fear, our children to dream without limit, and our nations to stand without apology. We want peace, but not peace built on silence. We want prosperity, but not prosperity that depends on others' poverty. We want progress, but progress that honors our culture, our people, our land. If we're to build this new order, we must start by healing the old wounds. Let this assembly mark a turning point, not through resolutions written on paper, but through commitments honored in practice. The world has seen what happens when Africa is excluded. It is time to see what happens when Africa leads. We propose the creation of an equitable international credit system, one that recognizes human potential as collateral more valuable than commodities. We propose fair taxation of multinational corporations operating in developing nations, so that wealth generated in Africa builds African futures. We propose global investment in green energy, technology, and research driven by local expertise, for climate justice cannot exist without economic justice. And we propose, above all, unity, the unity of a continent that refuses to be divided again. For centuries, our borders were drawn by others. Now we must draw our own destiny. No empire, no creditor, no system of control can withstand a people united in purpose. To our brothers and sisters in every land who struggle against similar chains, know that Africa stands with you. The fight for justice is universal. Whether it is a worker demanding fair wages, a community defending its forest, or a nation seeking self-determination, our struggles are connected. As we lift our voices today, we are not crying for attention. We are proclaiming a rebirth. The rebirth of dignity, the rebirth of truth, the rebirth of the human will to shape its destiny. In this assembly, where the powerful and the powerless share the same floor, let us remember, no seat is higher than the truth. No economy is stronger than justice. And no civilization can endure if it denies others their right to exist with honor. Let us imagine the future that could be, a future where Africa's gold builds African schools, where its oil fuels African industry, where its diamonds fund African dreams. A future where our currencies are backed by our creativity, our resources by our responsibility, and our governance by our people's consent. That is the future we seek, not one of isolation, but of integrity, not one of revenge, but of renewal. We must end the cycle of dependency and begin the cycle of dignity. We must end the habit of waiting for solutions and start creating them. We must end the world's pity for Africa and begin the world's partnership with Africa. To the youth of my continent, I say this: you are not inheriting ruins. You are inheriting responsibility. Do not wait for permission to lead. Build, innovate, create, dream. Let your imagination be the currency of the future. To the leaders of the world, I say this: partnership with Africa is not an act of generosity. It is an act of wisdom. The problems of the world, climate change, migration, inequality, cannot be solved without Africa. Our land, our people, and our perspective are essential to global balance. And to my fellow African leaders, I say this with conviction: unity is not an option, it is a necessity. Let us not compete for the approval of others, but cooperate for the advancement of all. Let us speak with one voice, act with one purpose, and walk with one vision. A vision of an Africa that governs itself, feeds itself, educates itself, and defines itself. The world may not be ready for a self-determined Africa, but Africa is ready for itself. We are ready to rise, not as clients of history, but as its co-authors. We are ready to negotiate trade that respects our labor, investments that build our industry, and cooperation that honors our sovereignty. We are ready to teach the world that justice is not a theory, it is a practice. If this assembly still believes in the values inscribed on its own walls, equality, sovereignty, and peace, then let those values apply not only to the powerful, but to all nations. Let the principles of the United Nations be more than speeches and ceremonies. Let them be the compass by which humanity finds its way back to balance. History is watching us. The future is listening. And the children yet unborn will ask what we did when the moment came. Did we protect the old systems, or did we create a new one worthy of their hope? Let it be written that in this century, Africa rose, that we looked beyond our wounds and built with wisdom, that we reached beyond our borders and acted with courage, that we dare to believe that the world could be fair and made it so. For our story is not one of endless suffering. It is one of endless strength. Every attempt to break us only proved how unbreakable we are. Every attempt to silence us only gave our voice greater depth. Every attempt to divide us only revealed the truth of our unity. So let the world hear us clearly. The age of dependence has ended. The age of dignity has begun. And we will not retreat. We will not bow. We will not beg. We will build.